So we are continuing on with this series that we started last week, titled "The Bible Tells Me So." And we're looking at just some popular childhood Bible stories, ones that we typically use in children's Sunday school and vacation Bible school, and those things. Again, these stories that we hear as kids, but oftentimes though we don't ever go back to these stories as adults. And whether we heard them as kids for the first time, or even if you didn't grow up in the church and never have heard these stories, these are very popular stories, ones that if you've never heard of the Bible before, you've heard of most of these stories. In fact, today's story we're looking at is the story of Noah, okay, and Noah's Ark, and so that is certainly one that I think is very known and popular around. But also there are details in these stories that, and we rightfully so, leave out when we teach it to our kids. And again, I think this graphic just speaks very well to the fact that if you open the Bible and read it, and you're like, "What? That's in there?" And it is in there, and I think that's one of the reasons why I love the Bible and why I believe that the Bible's true, because it doesn't leave out the embarrassing parts. Right? It tells us the whole story, right? And again, if you were just going to make it up, right, there's lots in the Bible that wouldn't be in there, right? We would leave it out if you were making it up just to make a good impression. And so with that, again, as we saw last week with Adam and Eve and in creation, the Garden of Eden, there's certainly that. And so today we're going to jump in to Noah just a few chapters after where we left off last week in Genesis chapter 6. And so we're going to jump right into the story of Noah and his family. But before we do that, though, is realize that I want to look at what was life like on earth before the flood. Okay, just right before the flood. So we're going to see that in just these few verses that start off in Genesis chapter 6. And we're going to start at verse 5. So Genesis 6, verse 5. It says, "The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on earth. It broke his heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I've created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them." But Noah found favor with the Lord. So as we see these verses, and again, it paints a very clear picture of what the earth was like. I mean, we started with Adam and Eve, of perfection. Right? Their bodies were perfect. Creation was perfect. There was no, disease or evil running in the world until, again, as we saw last week, they ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and started this downward spiral towards death and destruction for us as humans, right, and for God's creation. Now, we see that then when we pick up here in chapter 6, verse 5, we realize that the downward spiral from the Garden of Eden towards death and destruction had escalated very, very quickly. It escalated very quickly. Like I said, we went from Genesis 3, right, of perfection. Now we're at the beginning of 6 at notice the description that God gives here in verse 5, right, is that it has escalated to consistently and totally evil. Right now, this between Adam and Noah, there is only 10 generations. So in 10 generations, we went from perfection, right, to completely and consistently evil. Right? Again, that's what we see in verse 5, which is again where the story starts, right? The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness, right, on the earth, and he saw that everything that they thought or imagined was consistently, totally evil. Yeah, I encourage you to underline that phrase, consistently and totally evil. And it escalated, and it escalated quickly. Right, and it ended up right at this point. Now, when we see this point where we ended up, I want to point out what is God's response to the state of his creation. Right, God's response then is given to us in verse 6, right, where it says that he was sorry that he had ever made them. And it says that it broke his heart. Now, as we saw last week, God was relationally motivated in his creation, right? We were created for a relationship, right? And primarily for a relationship with him. right? And God is holy, and God is righteous, and God cannot, again, be in a relationship with sin. And yet his creation was consistently and totally evil. And so what broke God's heart? Well, the fact that the relationship between himself and his creation was completely severed, right? Except for Noah. Right, as you see in verse 8, right, it says, and yet Noah found favor with the Lord. And so, therefore, Noah was the only exception to this very dark culture. Okay, Noah was the only exception to this very dark culture, which is why then we pick up and we find the story of Noah. Right, and then in verse 9, right, as the story continues, okay, is that we're introduced to Noah and to his family. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on earth at the time, and he walked in close relationship with God. So we see his creation, again, was consistently and totally evil. The relationship had been severed between God and humans, except for Noah, and yet here is Noah's status. Right? It says that he was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on the earth at the time, because he walked in close fellowship with God. Now, this verse does not say that Noah was sinless, right? But it says that he was righteous. Now, again, he was a sinful being, just like every human being is, right? But why was he seen as blameless by God? Well, because he was in a close fellowship with God. Right? It's because of God's presence and his relationship with God that made him blameless in this incredibly dark and evil culture. Right? And because, notice, again, it was his righteousness, right, that made him blameless and in fellowship with God. It was that connection that was still happening between God and Noah, right, is why he was the exception. So I want to continue on in the story then of Noah, and what God asked him to do. In Genesis chapter 6, we're going to pick up in verse 11. Now God saw that the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God observed all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So God said to Noah, I have decided to destroy all living creatures, for they have filled the earth with violence. Yes, I will wipe them out, all out along with the earth. So build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout its interior. Make the boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Leave an 18-inch opening below the roof all the way around the boat. Put the door on the side and build 3 decks inside the boat, lower, middle, and upper. Look, I'm about to cover the earth with a flood that will destroy every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will die, but I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring a pair of every kind of animal, male and female, into the boat with you to keep them alive during the flood. Pairs of every kind of bird and every kind of animal and every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And be sure to take on board enough food for your family and for all of the animals. And so Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. So as we see, again, the setup of what God is about to do is here God gives Noah some very odd instructions. In fact, just imagine what Noah thought as he heard this from God. Like God says, hey, again, God didn't tell him anything he didn't already know, right? This world is a horrible place. I mean, these people are completely evil. I mean, there's violence everywhere. There's all this. Again, Noah knew that, right? But then God says, but I'm going to do something about it. Okay? And by the way, you're going to be a major player in my plan. And in order for this to play out, I need you to build a boat. Okay, and on that boat, you're going to house your family and all these animals. And now I can just imagine, again, that Noah had all kinds of questions for God, right, as he heard this plan and these instructions. Because likely, Noah had probably never even seen a large body of water before. And I would think his first question was, what's a boat? And yet God said, build this. right? And he gave him the dimensions, and he says, and this is why you need it, right? Because this is what I'm about to do. Right? And so, again, God gave Noah some very, very odd instructions, and then we see in this final verse of chapter 6, right, what Noah's response was to this. Right? He did exactly what God asked. Right? He got a whole bunch of instructions, right? Ones that he probably had no idea of what it really meant, or even, again, how the details were going to work out, and yet he did exactly what God asked. Right? And so we see then, again, verse 22, Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. Now, so many times, I think there are times when, again, God gives us something to do, and yet we just come back with lots of questions. And like, God, there's so many things that I don't understand. There's so many things I don't get this. And yet, we can follow Noah's example of saying, even when we don't understand it, we can still be obedient. Right? And that's exactly what Noah did. Right? And it says he did exactly what God asked. And then we continue on in the story into Genesis chapter 7 and through 8:19, which is where then we get to the flood. Okay, and in verse 7, or chapter 7, verse 1, right, he says, when everything was ready, the Lord said to Noah, go into the boat with your family. For among all the people of the earth, I can see that you alone are righteous. And so we go from, again, 6:22, right? Noah did everything that he was commanded to do, and then to 7:1, where now, again, everything was ready. There's a large span of time in between 6:22 and 7:1. Right? And again, we don't know how long, I have no idea how long it took him to build it. The text doesn't tell us. Right? But we know that, again, it's not something that was built overnight. Right? It was something that, again, Noah had to be consistently obedient to, and to get to the end of what God had asked him to do. And then we get to 7:1 when everything is ready. Right? And they are told to board the boat. And then we get into the familiar part of the story, which is when the rains start. Right, and the flood starts, and it tells us that, again, that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and then the water remained, at its current level for 150 days before it started to recede. And then they saw that, and then they eventually, ran on ground on the top of a mountain, and then they waited longer, and all this. Now, as we get through the story, we realize they were on the boat about a year total. But as we do that, again, I'm not going to read in respect of time. I'm not going to read the entire story and details of the actual flood, because, like I said, this is a very popular story. This is one that we've heard of before. And I think it's very represented very well by this picture, right? Of the fact, this childhood story that we see of the ark, all the animals sticking out, and Noah on the front of it going like, this is driving me crazy. And all this, again, we know this picture, and I think even with that, again, this is a story, whether you know the Bible or not, you've heard this story. We see pictures like this all over our culture. Right? Now, the truth is that, that there are flood stories that are included, and in not just the biblical narrative, but in truthfully, a lot of cultures around the world that have never seen the Bible, right, have a flood story involved in their history and their stories, right, of creation. But with that said, it's out there all over the place. And we see, again, pictures like this everywhere. And I think because of that, this story also becomes one of the biggest targets for skeptics of the Bible. Okay, it's out there because there are, just like I'm sure Noah had, for us, there's lots of details that kind of don't make sense. Like, there are lots of things where it's like, well, how would all the animals fit, right? Is that even possible? Like, why would God destroy the earth? Was, all these details that are in the text that we don't look at, and also, lots of questions. Right now, I've realized again that how much this story is shot at and scrutinized when it comes to the skeptic to the Bible. Several years ago, I was on a mission trip in San Francisco. I went there with a group of students, and we went there. We did. In fact, I've been on a mission trip to San Francisco several times. Now, San Francisco is a city that gets a lot of mission trips and groups that go there, and everybody in the city knows that, right? Especially their homeless population. But that's one of the reasons why they get a lot of teens, is because they have a very large homeless population in San Francisco. So we were there on this trip, and on the trip we worked at a lot of different ministries and food pantries and soup kitchens and did a lot of different tasks with these local missionaries we were with in the city. And so we were given different things to do for different days, and we were broken into smaller groups. And so my group, one day we were assigned, we took some socks and some food and some different stuff down to a very popular park in the city. And so our task for that day was to go down to hand out these items to these different homeless people and whoever was there that they would want, but the point would be to strike up a conversation with them, right? And hopefully be able to share Christ. And so we get down there again. It ends up there's a couple students and myself, and we go into this park, and we come up to this man that was in the park, and again they knew why we were there. Again, they see teens all the time, and in fact this guy was very bold in the fact, and honestly I think he just wanted a pair of clean socks, and he saw that we had them, and again he knew why we were there, and so it was enough of a draw for whatever reason. He came up to us, and right away he came up, and his opening line, right, which I wouldn't suggest this as an opening line if you really want something somebody has, but his opening line was, well, you're here to talk about the Bible, aren't you? Right? And we're like, well, yeah, we are. And he's like, the Bible's not true. I just straight off, right? And we're like, oh, okay, well, great. Like, why do you think that? Right? Again, as he comes up to this, both of the students that were with me were just kind of looking at me, right? Because they're not sure what to do. Right, and he's looking at me, right? He's like, the Bible's not true. I was like, well, why do you think that? Why do you think that? Why do you say that so emphatically? And he said, well, because whales would never fit on Noah's Ark. I mean, was what he said, right? And again, he says that, and he's just looking straight at me, and the students kind of looked at me, right? And they're all wondering, and I kind of just looked back, and I was like, well, you're right. They wouldn't fit on the ark, but where do whales live? And he was like, and I was like, a whale wouldn't die in a flood. And he just kind of looked at me, and the students looked at me, and then he says, I love the Bible. The Bible's so true. I believe everything in the Bible. And it took everything from from the three of us to not laugh at this guy, right? But ultimately, he got the clean socks. I mean, right? But we talked to it again. We had this conversation. But again, this story draws skeptics, right? And if somebody's gonna try and fire some arrows at the Bible, they typically start here. Right? And yet, when Noah was given these instructions by God, right, then, again, he was obedient to them. But yet, there were a lot of details that Noah left up to God, and he just didn't worry about it. And throughout the story, they said, as we see that, I will point out a few details that he left up to God. Noah didn't know, but yet God worked them out. The first one is this, is that God gave Noah the dimensions and the details of the boat. They said he gave him very detailed instructions. And again, we get the Cliff Notes version, right, in Genesis 6, and yet, again, Noah didn't know how to build a boat, but yet God told him very specifically what to do. Right? And he just did what God told him. Not just that, but there was, again, more details probably that Noah did not know or understand. Right? The next one is the fact that God brought the animals into the boat. And again, that's probably, you would think, well, this, God told Adam, Noah, build his boat, I'd bring all these animals, make it big enough to fit these animals, whatever. But yet you can see there's three different references within the story that point out that God brought the animals to the boat, not Noah. Right? And all Noah had to do was build it. Right? And then God brought the animals to him. Right? Now, with that said, is that, again, Noah did not have to, wonder, man, is there any animals that I forgot? Like, are there some that are supposed to be on here that aren't on here? Again, that was not his responsibility. Like, God took care of that detail. Now, also in that is, again, we believe God is smart, right? God is wise, right? And my assumption is that God would not send full-grown adult animals to that ark. He probably would have sent babies to go get on that ark. Because a baby giraffe doesn't have to stick his head out the top of the ark. Right? And also, again, if you've been around, around animals, no, in a storm when things are, and they're scared, right, the animals hunker down and they sleep a lot. Right? And so those baby animals on that ark would have been very sedentary. Right? Again, God is smart enough to figure that out. Right? And now we see in that, again, the next detail is even the fact that God closed the door of the ark. Again, God closed the door. And this, I think, once again, we see as an act of grace for Noah and his family. Again, they did not have the responsibility to decide what got on the ark and what didn't. And also, they did not have the responsibility of shutting anybody else out. God closed the door. Right? And they did not have to carry the guilt of that, of saying like, but they just did what God told them to do, and God took care of the other details, like closing out everything else that wasn't on the boat. And then all the way at the end of the story, in the end of chapter 8, not the end of chapter 8, partway through chapter 8, then God also told them when to leave the boat. Again, they were just obedient to what God did. God took care of the details. And I don't know about you, but I know for me, there are times when I really worry about the details of things that God's asking me to do. And yet God just says, you be obedient and leave the details up to me. Right? And God can take care of those details. And he did for Noah, and he does for us, if we do exactly what God commands. And then we fast forward then to chapter 8, verse 20. Which gives us then life after the flood. And so then we see, again, what is life like once they get off the boat. So we're going to pick up the story then in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, where it says, Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent towards evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. And then God blessed Noah and his sons and told them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So we see they get off of the boat, and that Noah's first action after leaving the boat was worship. Again, I don't know what it was like to be cramped in a boat with your family for a year, but I can imagine Noah wanted to do a whole list of things when he got off of that boat. And yet the first thing he did was worship. Right? He went and he sacrificed. Okay, and he, again, sacrificed, and those was an act of worship, again, that we see happening before the flood, that, again, happened after the flood. And notice that even that detail God had taken care of, because there were certain animals that there was more than just a pair of. In fact, Scripture says out of the clean animals that there was multiples that God sent onto that boat, because it was a part of God's plan. And again, Noah was obedient in that. Right? And that there was more than 2 of those clean animals, and it was so that he could sacrifice once he left the boat. And that's exactly what he did, right? Which we see again in verse 20, right? He built an altar, right? And again, I'm sure he had a long construction list at that point, right? But yet he built an altar, and he sacrificed those offerings, and he worshiped the Lord. And then we see this familiar command that we also saw God give Adam and Eve last week, right? That he now gives to Noah and his family, and that is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Now, the difference between this command he gives to Noah and his family in Genesis chapter 9 versus the command he gave Adam and Eve in Genesis 1, right, is the fact that God gave that command to Adam and Eve before the fall. And now he gives the same command to Noah and his family when he knows the condition of our hearts. And yet God's love and grace still wants to fill the earth. Right? And we see that command, and as then they live that out. And then, as you see as well, as that God then establishes a covenant between God and all creatures that is sealed with a rainbow. He establishes a covenant that is between God and all creatures that is established in a rainbow. And we're going to read about that covenant then in chapter 9, starting at verse 8. So that's Genesis 9, verse 8. Then God told Noah and his sons, I hereby confirm my covenant with you and your descendants, and with all the animals that were on the boat, with you, the birds, the livestock, all the wild animals, and every living creature on the earth. Yes, I am confirming my covenant with you. Never again will flood waters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. Then God said, I am giving you a sign of my covenant with you and with all living creatures for all generations to come. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds, and it is a sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. When I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life, and when I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will remember the eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth. Then God said to Noah, yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant that I am confirming with all the creatures on the earth. Now, this word covenant, this is a kind of a fancy word for a promise or an agreement. Okay, and we see this word, this idea of a covenant, that continues on throughout Scripture. Okay, this is the first formal covenant that is made, okay, between God and his people, but it is not the last one. Okay, we see God continuing through his plan of redemption and making new covenants as he moves through his plan to redeem us all. And as we see then this covenant, this promise, this agreement, then we see the seal or the reminder of this promise is the rainbow. And notice, though, first and foremost, that this is a reminder for God about the covenant. Because remember, let's go back again to God's reaction before the flood, right? It was, he looked at creation and he said, it is consistently and totally evil, and it broke God's heart. And so therefore, he moved into judgment. And now we have now in this covenant he makes after the flood is with the rainbow, it's to remind God of saying, no matter how much my heart hurts because of their sin, grace wins over judgment. Right? It's a reminder to God, right, that grace wins. That forgiveness and redemption is what I am focusing on now instead of judgment. Right? And it first and foremost reminds God not to destroy the earth no matter how sinful we become. And then a secondary sign for us, right? When we see a rainbow, it is a sign of comfort and of hope that God does not forget about us. Right? God does not forget about us, and that love and grace will ultimately win out over judgment. Again, in Genesis 9, 11, and 13, again, just a review for you. Again, we see that rainbow, right, and it's placed in the cloud, and it is a sign of God's covenant. First, a reminder to God, right, and then a reminder to us, right, of the fact that grace wins over judgment. And then we see the last story of Noah's life, okay, before he ends in Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 to 27. And it says, after the flood, Noah began to cultivate the ground, and he planted a vineyard. One day he drank some wine he had made, and he became drunk and lay naked inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw that his father was naked and went outside and told his brothers. And then Shem and Japheth took a robe and held it over their shoulders and backed into the tent to cover their father. As they did this, they looked the other way so they would not see him naked. And when Noah woke up from his stupor, he learned what Ham, his youngest son, had done. And then he cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. May Canaan be cursed. May he be the lowest of servants to his relatives. And then Noah said, may the Lord, the God of Shem, be blessed, and may Canaan be his servant. May God expand the territory of Japheth, and And may Japheth share the prosperity of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. And Noah lived another 350 years after the great flood, and he lived 950 years, and then he died. Now, when I look at this last story in Noah's life, again, this is one of those times when you look at the Bible and think, this has to be true, because if it was made up, that would not be in there. Right? Out of 350 more years, that's the story that we're going to learn. Right? And yet, it is exactly the story, as you see, the last story of Noah's life. Right? So why is it in there? Why is it included? Okay, it is included because it shows us that even after the flood, the shame of sin is still there. The shame of sin is still there. Right? We saw nakedness come up in the creation story, right? And how when they realized they were naked, the shame of their sin entered the world. And yet, nakedness comes up again, and we see that shame is still there. Again, God did not solve our sin problem through the flood. Right? The shame of sin is still there. Right? Again, we see that in again, his son's reaction to this when they find the news, right? It says they literally did anything they could to cover their father and not see his shame. Right? The shame of sin was still there. Right? But so is the hope for redemption. Right? The shame of sin is still there, and so is the hope of redemption. Because I want to rewind a little bit back to chapter 8, verse 21 and 22. Again, we saw Noah's first action was worship after the flood, but look at God's reaction. Okay, God's reaction in chapter 8, verses 21 and 22. It says that the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice. And he said to him, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race. And even though everything they think or imagine is bent towards evil from childhood, I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting, harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night. Again, before the flood, right, it was consistently and totally evil. And now after the flood, we see that we still have evil, right? The shame of sin is still there, right? But it says, but our hearts are bent towards evil, right? But now God, again, his response is he changes his focus. Instead of recreating the earth, which is what he did through the flood, he is now focused on recreating his people. Right? The flood reset, right, the spiral of the creation, the earth, the cosmos. Right? And yet it also refocused God on recreating us as sinners. Right? Romans 5, 6, and 8, again, remind us of this fact. Right? It says, when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. Again, God looks at our hearts and says, they are still bent towards evil. But now my plan of recreating them is through Christ. Right? And we are reminded one more time through the gospel of Christ that grace and love wins over judgment. Because we are now recreated, right, through the power and redemption of Christ. And so as we see that, and again, what do we take from the story of Noah, right, is the fact that God loves us, that God knows that we are sinful, and yet still chooses to save us, to redeem us, right, to recreate us from the inside out, to focus on recreating us as his people instead of his creation. And so that leads then to our final thought for this morning. And that is, no matter how bad life seems, God is still actively involved and at work to redeem his creation. And are you doing exactly what God is asking you to do? And that's the example that Noah gives us in this story, right? Was he did exactly what God is asking him to do. And so that then is the challenge for us. Are we doing exactly what God is asking us to do? Because that is God's plan of redemption, to redeem us and to save us. Again, I don't know what the next step in your journey is. Right? And if you don't know what the next step in your journey is, then you should ask God. And if you do know, then we need to follow the example of Noah and do exactly what he's commanded.